So hello everyone and welcome to week 4 of the Pink Singers LGBT History Month celebrations 2021. It's been a very interesting month for us. I think we've heard lots of different stories from lots of different people who have been part of the community, part of the Pink Singers choir, and people who've actually worked with us in the past as well. When we set out to mark this month, we wanted to sort of surface some of the more interesting stories that come from members of the choir. And this time it's been an opportunity for us to really hear them in ways that we haven't before. This session is going to be a very special one because we're going to take a little bit of a step back and look at how our history is actually collected and presented. So rather than the contents of the talks that we've heard over the last month, we're going to look at how these talks are put together, but not just the talks, the zine, and also, as you heard from today's Chris's work on the archive. So really just to, I guess, to kick things off, I know, Pippa, you have some opinions about what history is and what that actually means. I think when we started off this session with Sue Sanders, she presented a particular vision of history. And then as we've gone through in the following weeks, we've had more sort of personal expressions of history. What's your take on history, Pippa?
So I think that there's often, or there can be, a really strict idea of what history is and what it contains and what it's not. And I don't think one necessarily has to be like more important or more valid than the other. But I think that does also include looking at what stories we're already telling, what stories we're not telling, why we're only telling certain stories and not others. And that's also sort of where the zine comes in. As a choir, a lot of us joined exactly because we're not necessarily all really comfortable taking like a spotlight on our own and taking the center stage with only, you know, our names up in lights. We want to be part of like a collective thing. And in looking at history, that's really important that, you know, obviously there's the individual trailblazers that we know, and there's the individual incidents that spark a conversation or a societal change. But the vast majority of the work is done in like really everyday circumstances, is done by people, I don't know, like it can be people in a community cooking for each other or cleaning for each other. And it can be stories that are shared, you know, over a cup of tea. And that is as much part of community building, and it's as much part of history as, like, you know, being part of a particular riot or a particular uprising.
Yeah, no, I found that really interesting, actually. When we started off with Sue Sanders' talk on LGBT history, she picked out people who were significant in history, but she's coming at it from an educator's perspective. So there is definitely, I guess, an agenda in sort of trying to identify people and then reclaim components of history. But I think over the last couple of weeks, where we've had conversations with Oscar, and then for the It's a Sin conversation, we've had much more personal stories. And in a way, I've just found that I could engage personally much better with those stories because they were relevant to me, or they were people I know, or that they are experiences that I've been through. And I think that's important too. I think that you have the big stories, but you also have the smaller stories, which are a necessary part of our history. I know Chris and I, we've had a lot of conversations around the nature of history. Chris, do you want to sort of say something on that?
Well, the nature of history, wow. I mean, something that I was thinking about when Pippa was just talking is like these, you know, when we were looking at the items from the archive earlier, lots of those things that we were looking at were flyers or programs or, you know, small bits of paper. And in institutional archives and corporate archives, that would go in the bin. You know, they're kind of considered ephemeral records, but for us, they're really core records of our activities. You know, I think just thinking about the nature of those kind of ephemeral life of a community and how you recognize it and how you discover and, you know, retell those stories. Well, the collection that I was talking about of Black queer history at the LMA that was curated by the artists Ajamu and Topher Campbell, the majority of that is things like flyers, it's like little, you know, cards that advertise club nights or events. And if you really interrogate the details of that, you find the details of community and activity and action, but on their own, they're just a little piece of card, you know, with a bit of information about one event that happened 30 years ago.
I think that's really fascinating. So these small parts represent components of our history, but the actual sort of narrative then has to be constructed by someone at some point. I mean, maybe a collective approach or maybe an individual. Annie, do you want to talk about sort of how history is put together?
Yeah, thank you. I've got probably about 5 hours worth of things to say about this. But I will try and be selective. Chris, I was really glad that you brought in Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexualwissenschaft, which was set up in the Roaring Twenties in Berlin to survey, and actually it brought together a community of queers, including trans and non-binary people, around his archive, basically his library. And the Nazis burnt his book collection. They also burnt all the data he'd gathered in a survey in Berlin of who was queer, how many people were trans, how did people live, who did they live with and where. And I really recommend this book that's come out by a colleague of mine called A Nazi Word for a Nazi Thing. And it's kind of a book about the history of the burning of that archive. And it's also about queer art making more generally. So the author, they note that Eisenstein came to Berlin and he wanted to meet Hirschfeld. So Eisenstein's one of the first filmmakers, and they didn't meet and they didn't make the film that Eisenstein wanted to make. So it's about the gaps in history, gaps in queer history and in art making. And so uses the word Sexualwissenschaft, which means the study of sex and gender, or sexology. And so repurposes that word to talk about queer knowledge. So as a queer community, we have a different epistemology, which means the creation, the production of knowledge. We speak about a different kind of knowing when we think about queer archiving. So heteronormative cultures have marriage certificates, they have names, surnames. What is the sexual knowledge? What's the queering of knowledge that we want to archive? I'll stop there for now.
I think that raises so many questions, and perhaps we can go into greater depth later on, because I'm aware that we have certain constraints on this particular talk. So when it comes down to the Pink Singers history, I mean, Chris, you probably have one of the greatest contacts with the material that we have, and I suppose some of the perceptions that we have. And I also wanted to sort of mention that I think in the last couple of talks that we've had, there's certain things that keep coming up, certain themes that keep coming up. So the idea of, family, of resistance, of music making, of a communality, a shared experience, all of these things. When it comes down to it, who writes this story? I mean, we have components of it on the blogs, we have it in the zine, for instance. Whose voices are most dominant in this narrative?
Well, I mean, I think that the blog is the place where a lot of the stories get told, and my knowledge of the blog isn't all encompassing, but I'm sure that there's certain people have written more blogs than other people, partly through having the time, or partly through wanting to do it. Certainly I think that as part of this, we need to think about what's available for people to work with, and also giving people opportunities to work with the material that we do have. Looking at the blog, it's really great from the current era, and there's some backfilling, but actually there's lots of stuff missing. There's lots of opportunities to go back into the physical and digital archives and then reinterpret that material, tell some stories, and there's no reason that anyone couldn't do that. It could be anyone telling those stories, and you could easily pick and choose things that you want to talk about, things that you're interested in. I would think it would be really great if someone went back into the archives and looked at the records of women in the 1980s in the Pink Singers and kind of picked out the details from the minutes and the records and the photographs and told those stories in more depth for us. That'd be brilliant.
Yeah, and I think there are definitely gaps, and I think you speak of gaps in terms of the actually archived material, but there are also gaps in terms of voices in our archive. And I think Pippa, you you have expressed issues around representation in the storytelling that we do. Do you want to sort of talk about that?
Yeah. So again, I think a lot of the sort of the main ways in which we tell stories outwardly, and the stories that are paid most attention to tend to be the ones that are either in blog form, or it's, you know, a solo that someone's done for a particular concert. But that requires a certain kind of personality, but also requires certain like filling in of one's life. Like Chris, you mentioned that the blogs are probably written by the people who have the most time to do so, and the people who feel able to do so. Like for instance, there's people here who are parents, who are caring for family members, who may have got really, really intense and unstable scheduling with their jobs. And you can't always expect people to then, for instance, write like an 800-word blog, because people might not have the time for that. So then it's the people who do have a particular lifestyle and who do, you know, are comfortable with being the singular person to whom something is attributed, or the singular person who's responsible for something, whose story then gets told. And the same goes for, yeah, like solos or taking responsibilities in terms of audio or video editing, that kind of thing. It takes a certain kind of person, but that means that that is the kind of person who gets to set the frame and set the narrative for what we are as the Pink Singers, which is not necessarily representative of everyone who's actually in the choir.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm very reminded of Oscar's metaphor for handing the microphone to other people to tell their own stories. But at the same time, I'm mindful also that perhaps a microphone isn't the right tool to use, and that there may well be other tools that people would prefer would be more comfortable with, so that they can express themselves. Hence, you know, things like the zine, for instance, which I think were a very sort of innovative way of trying to get people to tell different stories, or amplify different kinds of voices. I'm also worried personally that we have institutional barriers to telling stories. Even in this set of material, these set of videos that we've been putting together over this month, there have been concerns that, you know, who's going to see this? Is it going to be interesting enough? And there's then this automatic kind of curation of whose voices can and cannot be heard, which I think is quite challenging. We use history in so many different ways, and there's a history of the Pink Singers that goes into how we can brand ourselves and how we can market ourselves. But there's also a history of the Pink Singers and how we should be telling and recording these stories. And these things aren't always compatible with each other, unfortunately. And we get this sort of utilitarian view of history where, you know, we are recording something so that we can do something with it, which is probably the wrong approach to take when it comes to collecting stories. Annie, do you want to sort of add something to that?
I was just thinking about what archives are, and so the archive, the word comes from the ancient Greek archaeon, which is where the law papers were kept. So the archons were the people in ancient Greece who wrote the law, and they like stored the documents in their houses. So it's like when we decide what to keep and what we keep a track of, we're kind of producing something, or something extremely powerful, and it's producing something for the future, what can be known in the future. And yeah, my field, cultural theory, talks about archives being dynamic. Like they're not it's not like data gathering kind of just tracks what's happening in a neutral way. It makes decisions, and we make decisions that produce something that's there, and they also immediately exclude something else. So we need to think about archiving as a dynamic process, and have a sense of responsibility about, you know, what do we include. And also what you were saying about we can't expect people who are carers or key workers or have life-changing health conditions or something to write an 800-word blog post. And I was thinking about the film 120 Beats Per Minute about the AIDS crisis and the activism in France. And the activists, they kind of write with blood, like they turn the River Seine red and they spray blood on the buildings of pharmaceutical companies. And I think that's the kind of writing. So it's about, well, what would we say, oh no, that's not worth including? Does it have to be sort of a piece of writing or a flyer from a concert or a recording from a concert? Can we be really creative about, let's archive quite radical, sort of anarchival, like anarchic archiving. And, in a way, I would say, let's include anything that people are willing to give. And not sort of just the documentation of our really official things like concerts. And also maybe in the breakout groups, we can think about, what do people think? Oh no, that's not worth sending in, or I wouldn't feel that I've got anything to give.
Well, hopefully people will tell us what they want to put in the archive. We can talk about that in a minute. One of the things that kind of archival theorists talk about, they say archives are always in a constant state of becoming, and it sort of reflects the fact that you might have a documentary archive, which is some just bits of paper, but then when you reinterpret it, when you tell those stories, when you pick things, you're curating, you're kind of changing the archive, and you're growing it. It's growing into something new. It's becoming all the time. And I think that there's lots of ways that we interpret our archive. We bring our stories to life. We pull things out from the dusty attic and bring them out onto the blog and make them all shiny and new. But you're right, like thinking about who tells those stories and how they choose what to talk about is a really crucial part of this process.
Mm.
I think the other gap that you highlighted earlier, Chris, was really to do with the social life of the choir. So we have a very public-facing image, which means that there's a certain, I guess, that there's that brand, and we have all the photography and the text that goes along with that public image. But the choir is much more than that. And it's much more of the social exchange that happens, the conversations that we have in the pub when we can be in the pub, all of that sharing of stories and experiences that I'm really missing at the moment, and which I think the last couple of weeks of talks have actually helped to rekindle, because you can sort of hear these stories again when the opportunities suddenly seem to have been taken away from us. How do you think we can capture that component of our history?
My instinct that's coming up at the moment is about sort of sensing the gaps, and instead of speaking and storytelling, actually listening, like leaving silence and leaving space in which then maybe less assertive voices or forms of knowledge creation, whether that's the spraying of blood or whatever we want to do, emerge. So kind of minding the gap.
Yeah.
But I guess, how do you capture that social element as well? Like, one thing we've talked about is potentially asking people if they want to share things on social media that then go into the archive. So, we have a great record of concerts at the choir sing, but we don't necessarily capture all of that social hanging out around the concerts or getting ready for the concerts or rehearsing, and people do share that stuff on social media. And I think because it's on social media, people think, oh, that's in our archive, but actually it's not. It's kind of drifting down the, what do you call it, the timeline into the ether.
And Liang and I often joke about the photography at concerts, because we're both pretty fastidious about taking photographs in the rehearsal. And so I always take photos I try to take them spontaneously, which is why inevitably someone has food in their mouth at the time. So every single one of my photos has someone eating something, basically. Liang takes slightly more posed photographs, and so he complements that. But we actually stand next to each other on stage, and so all our photos are basically from the same angle. So we have slightly varying angles of the same photographs when we share them into the archive. And also, I think because we're both from the same section and we're both of the same gender, and to a certain extent we have very overlapping social groups, we tend not to have access to every part of the choir. And I think that's one of the things that I recognize as someone who who creates material that goes into our archive. Anyway, I think the last subject I think we should talk about is the 40th anniversary, which is coming up very soon in 2023. The last time we had this kind of conversation was in 2013 for the 30th anniversary. But I was just wondering what people's ideas were on how we might mark this significant milestone.
I mean, I've been banging on about this for ages. I would love us to have a best of the 80s recording, or sorry, compilation. Something I've been doing this year is listening to all of the kind of cassette recordings from the 80s, and you know, it's quite variable. There's some really great stuff and some not so great stuff, but there's some really brilliant songs that I think we haven't really uncovered because they're only on audio and not video. Like lots of the archive that we recover and put online is video, and this is all audio. So we had to think about how we would represent that. But yeah, I think I mean, obviously all the different phases of our history are worth looking into, but there's a whole kind of that long story of activism really begins in that culture of the 80s, and bringing some of that to life somehow would be really amazing, I think. Time for the 40th.
I was really interested, Chris, that you said the 90s is a big gap. It's like, what were we doing in the 90s? Was it a kind of period of recovery after the crisis?
A gap in the archive, do you mean?
Yeah, there's a gap in the Pink Singers archive in the 90s, and I'm like, well, that was that kind of a queer roaring 20s when, you know, good drugs came in after the AIDS crisis, and then thinking about COVID, and this is a period of maybe some intense archiving, not least because we're interacting in a really digital way. But you know, what are the 2020s? Will there be a gap then because we're just partying 24/7?
I think in terms of gaps in the archive, there's a lot to think about. You know, in the 80s, the collection that is in the Hall Carpenter archives was donated to them by Robert Hugel and collected in scrapbooks, I think, throughout the 80s, and so that constitutes quite a kind of comprehensive record of the 80s. In terms of the 90s and 2000s, we have lots in the archive, but it's not complete. And the way that the choir functions with committees and kind of different people running things, often collections get scattered around in lots of different places. So I had a really long conversation with Ling Nichols yesterday, for example, who has 2 massive boxes of Pinky stuff that she's sorting out for us. And Hsien has done loads of work digitizing photos from people like Rosie and Philip Gatter and various other people, you know. And I think that's a process that has happened and needs to continue happening, and you know, that's perhaps something that other people could get involved in somehow as well. That doesn't have to be something that's led by one of us. It could be led by anyone, that engagement process.
Yeah. And when we're talking about the 40th anniversary, I think when we had our planning meeting, I was thinking about the theme of chosen family being really evocative. And Hsien or Pippa, you said something about the intergenerational nature of the choir. So I wonder if that's a theme we can draw out around the 40th anniversary.
Yeah, I think one of the values of values is terrible. One of the things that I appreciate about being in this choir is the intergenerationality. So the idea that history can be conveyed. It's like you know, Oscar's story, which was about how he was in the Pink Singers and then moved on from the Pink Singers. So the Pink Singers affected him, and then he went on in a different direction. And then Rosie's and Howard's story of their individual stories of having been in the Pink Singers and how it affects me now. I think that's really interesting, the idea of going from individual to community, from community to individual over time. I love that idea of growth and that kind of narrative around it. And the only thing I wanted to add to the idea of the 40th anniversary is that I've been thinking about how things have been different in the last decade compared to the previous one when we last went through this kind of exercise. And I think that a lot of the conversations in the LGBT community itself have changed kind of the conversations. So there was a lot of resistance, and it's about fighting and marriage equality, but these have kind of been achieved. So some of the organization around it has diminished, but the conversations that we're having now are around intersectionality and around representation. And I think that we need to sort of make these part of the 40th anniversary, because, you know, as I was saying at the start of the very first talk, the Pink Singers is a truly diverse organization. You can't find LGBT groups that are like us, which is, the full spectrum of LGBT, the intergenerationality of it, the multicultural aspect of it. There's so many things that are very rare and very, very unique to our choir that I think we should be highlighting as kind of a microcosm of the wider LGBT community.
Pippa, did you have something about the 40th?
Well, I was thinking, because what you mentioned about the diversity of the choir, obviously a lot of the time the conversation around diversity is one that is sort of contrasted or compared to, okay, so is the choir representative of London, because that's where we're based, so that it would make sense for the choir to look like London, sort of irrespective of whether that's the case, and also keeping in mind that I hadn't yet joined the choir by the 30th anniversary, so I'm not sure to what extent this has already been done, but I think it would be interesting to see specifically how the choir is interwoven with London as a location, also because last time it sort of like traveled around the country, if I'm correct in
The
thinking
30th
that.
anniversary.
Yeah, the 30th anniversary. And I think the locality of where we rehearse, where we meet, where we're all sort of based, the tiny sort of hubs that then emerge around London where we meet and socialize outside of rehearsals, I think are really interesting as well, and potential like avenues into integrating even more with London, like as a city and as a locale.
Yeah, I think there are lots of interesting ideas there. We should definitely explore them. I think we've come to the point where, Pippa, I think you want to talk about the zine. So would you be able to have a quick chat?
Yeah, so the zine sort of came about during a meeting with the communities team, where we were talking about ways of looking at our history and archiving, etc. And Will and I sort of had the idea of doing a zine because it is the sort of threshold to participation is relatively low, because you can just engage to the extent that you feel comfortable to. You can engage, with as much time as you have with the particular skill set that you have and that you feel comfortable working with. And obviously, because it's an online zine, there's a lot of scope for multimedia projects. So it can be illustration, it can be written word, it can be videos, it can be, poetry, creative writing, whatever. And yeah, we were hoping that would be a way for people who may not always feel comfortable speaking out just by themselves to do something that is collaborative and that can also be anonymous if people want to, so that there's a way to contribute even if you don't necessarily fit within what we've traditionally seen as carrying on our history. So I think a couple of people who have contributed to the zine are going to talk for a bit about what they've done. Shall I hand over to Jess first, if that's all right?
Hello. I'm not sure I've got very much to say, but I think what Pippa just said about the threshold being low was something that probably did make me think that this was something that I would be able to do, that I wanted to, because sometimes I think I do want to contribute more, but I am concerned that I'm not going to have enough time, or that something's going to be a sort of a longer term project that I might not be able to commit to. But I like drawing, and I actually work in a historical picture library. So the whole kind of thing about archiving and LGBT History Month sort of felt something that I was just interested in anyway. And yeah, so I just thought, I'll have a go and I'll see what see what happens. And if it's rubbish, I don't need to send it in, kind of thing. And I just thought, you know, I'll just have a bit of a go. So in case people aren't sure who the people are in the picture, if I remember rightly, we've got Angela Davis, Christopher Isherwood and W.H. Auden, a rather young and pretty looking Quentin Crisp, and Radcliffe Hall, I think. Oh, and Ollie Alexander as well. And I think I'd sort of put Ollie Alexander in really because I mean, the others are all sort of much more what we might sort of think of perhaps as LGBT plus historical figures. But Ollie Alexander, I'd just seen the documentary he did about growing up gay, which I actually thought was really, really good. And obviously, you know, I'd seen it Hsien and stuff. So yeah, so I just thought I'd put him as well. So that was my contribution.
Brilliant. And Ed, do you want to speak next about your It's a Sin review / reflections?
Yes. As you may know, I'm usually a person of very few words. So I've written it. I wrote a piece because I wanted to get across to people who weren't around in the 80s what it was like for someone who hit puberty in the early 80s. So I was 12 in 1980, and I knew I was gay in 1981. So the article I wrote was a couple of pages, just about some of the background, what it was like going to a comprehensive school in the north of England. I was at school during the miners' strike in my last year of school, that sort of background. So that had quite an impact on me. So I was quite politically aware, but I was very frightened about knowing I was gay. And the people talk about the tabloids. The tabloids at the time, they were vicious, but it was in the mainstream media as well. Have a go, look on Radio 4 Extra and pick a comedy from the 70s or the 80s and go through with a stopwatch and see how far you can go before we get to the puff joke or the Irish joke. I think with a lot of the racist jokes, they do edit them out, but they don't seem to edit out the gay jokes. It'd be quite shocking for people under 40. And I think of all the scandals at the time, the one that shocked me the most was the Trestrail scandal, the head of the Met's Palace Security Force, Royal Security Force. And when someone broke into Buckingham Palace and had a conversation with the Queen, and she thought he was a footman who'd come to draw the curtain. So this head of security was forced to resign, but he was outed at the same time. And the press was more interested in him being gay. And on the mainstream news that evening, there were questions like, but couldn't you tell he was homosexual by just looking at him? And so it wasn't just in the tabloids. My first general election I could vote at was 1987. And Section 28 was a terrible thing, but it played into what was very popular at the time. And I wish someone would collect some of these news clips from the 80s, because I can remember ever so clearly the BBC 9 o'clock news on the run up to the elections, talking to a Labour supporter in London who wouldn't vote Labour that time round. And this man worked in a factory, a very working class background, a bit like myself. And he said, I'm not voting Labour because I don't want my son to grow up to be a puff. So I wish and that was on the mainstream BBC news. It wasn't just in the tabloids, it was very widespread. So that was one thing I've written about. That probably explains why I didn't come out till I was 37. And in the questionnaire, we were asked about historical figures that we were interested in. And I've always been interested in hidden history. And I got thinking about the wars, but about gay people then. Then I thought, what about the last people who were hanged in Britain who were gay? And it was 1835. And I couldn't find anything much online, like a list to commemorate all these people who've been hanged for that, or people who've been transported for similar crimes or for assisting. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. Maybe you say I'm crazy, but that might be a sort of project we could perhaps get involved in with a wider community that might introduce audiences to the choir who might not think about us so much. anyway, thank you very much for letting me have a say.
Well, thank you for writing your reflections. Andy, do you want to speak next about your 90-second nuggets?
Yeah, hi there. So I will be brief, hopefully. I set up 90-second nugget because, well, kind of for three reasons. One was to help people. Second reason, selfishly, was to learn more about myself. And the third reason was to be productive, because during lockdown I was living on my own. Still am actually living on my own. I think listening to the LGBT History Month has been really interesting for me, because the stuff around It's a Sin, which I found really powerful, and the Sally Ann and Jules and everyone else and Bruce from last week were amazing. What I've realised is that even though I normally come across as a very confident extrovert person, being in the Pink Singers has been helpful for me to add an extra dimension. My being gay, even though I came out at 18, I've never been a confident gay man at all. And so part of 90-second nugget for me is to be able to be authentic for me. So through the examples, I'm not overtly saying, oh, I'm gay, here I am. But what I'm saying is that I use examples, I reference him, or I reference they, or I reference the queer community. I'm trying to do it, and I've never done that before because I've never really been brave enough, even though at my age I probably should be, but I'm not. So it's been quite eye-opening. And I did a couple, one on my own personal body image, which was interesting and hopefully helpful for other people, because I have a very poor body image and it's getting better. We even managed to test some of the theories with which has been hilarious. And also the my own internalized homophobia, which shocked me when I realized how it played out in all parts of life. So I think the LGBT History Month for me has made me realize that sort of where we are born, the age we're born, and all of those elements go into creating who we are. And some of that manifests in our adult life and is not always helpful. That's what I want to say, really.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for for writing your piece for the zine.
No problem. Thank you.
Sorry, Sally Ann, do you want to talk about the poem that you wrote?
I'll read it to you if you like.
Yeah.
This was actually written in response to Clause 28 as an article that I wrote for what would probably be now described as a zine in the 1980s. You'll have to come and see me if I should. But anyway, I wrote an article about, I'm just trying to found it, about Clause 28. It was basically encouraging people to come and go on the march. I won't read the article, but if anybody's interested, we can talk about it privately, but I'm going to read the poem. I've always had this thing about the Holocaust, never again, and then when Clause 28 happened, picking on minority groups, silencing minority, it always scares the living bejeebers out of me and will to the day I fly off this mortal coil, which I hope won't be for a long time yet. This is called Public Embarrassment. A thorn in your side, as such, I persist to refuse to deny that I do exist. As you try to silence our rights to speak, I'll not go to my closet. I'll not stay meek. Oh, these queers and perverts, suppose they're okay if they keep their mouths shut, if they're out of the way. But in public interest, we'll make some new rules. Keep them out of our churches, keep them out of our schools. Your prejudice, bigotry against those you despise, come up time again in front of your eyes. I am what I am, and I do not repent. I am gay, not queer, sick, or bent. Why should we be coerced to exonerate your fears by pretending that we are not here? Why all this hatred for those of our kind? Your neurosis is your problem, not mine. So what will you do? What do you say? Would you lock us up, take our children away, ban us from cinemas, call us obscene? Deep down in your conscience, do you hear us scream? I am what I am, and I do not repent. I am gay, not sick, queer, or bent. And that's it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sally-Ann.
I think someone should set that to music.
Oh God, are you reading my mind again? Because I was thinking that, I mean, yeah, I can tell you more about the poem yet, but it's things that I would actually rather talk to people privately on a one-to-one basis rather than shout in front of X number of people. But say it was based on an article I wrote in protest against Clause 28. At the time when being gay was definitely not something that was admired. I was talking to a friend of mine I've known for 30 blah years this morning that we were on the march together. Well, we got separated, but he remembers people coming out of their doors and shouting abuse at us, which I don't remember. I think I was too close to the police van with Jimmy Somerville dancing them down it, trying not to get nicked at the time. But we have to, and he mentioned that God, that French film that Annie was talking about. But I was just so horrified. So yeah, if you want it setting to music, I can see what I can do. I know I've had my 5 minutes. I'll go back into my bed now. Take care. Hope that was useful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally-Ann. So what we're going to do now is we are going to have a quick 5-minute break. And I know there have been lots of things that we've been talking about that I hope have evoked some kind of thoughts in you and a response which you want to share. So when you come back, we'll be into small groups, and we're going to talk about things to do with LGBT history, and perhaps with a bit of a focus on how we can shape the 40th anniversary of the Pink Singers. So see you all in 5 minutes. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I think that was a really interesting conversation that we had in our individual breakout group. So I'm very interested to hear what people wanted to talk about. But I'm going to quickly just share this screen so I can show you some of the ideas that have come up as a result of what we've been talking about. And now the Zoom controls are in the way. There we go. Okay. So, Chris, do you want to sort of kick it off and tell me, what things you talked about in your group? Of course, I have a way of catching people while they have things in their mouths. So,
I was just about to eat a Malteser. Well, we talked about lots of things. We talked about what was missing from the archive, but also what we could put in it. And I think one of the things we were talking about is what will we have in the archive and what will we remember from this past year? Like, how will we be able to look back on this year and see what we've done, how it's potentially changed us, the ways in which it might have, fundamentally changed the nature of the choir in some ways. Murray offered to give us his planning charts, which is great. I think that's a brilliant idea. We also talked about trying to, pull out some different stories about other identity groups. There was a notion that there's a lot of kind of focus on the lesbian and gay history of the choir, but not so much on trans stories, bi stories. I think that's really important. And we talked about ways that we could perhaps look back into the archive and reinterpret things and pull things out from the minutes and look at those ideas and histories collectively.
Great. Sounds really interesting. Annie, what did you find out from your group?
We're talking just about the first question at the moment.
Well, anything, whatever was most interesting in your conversations.
I think we were talking about the 40th anniversary and what should be in the archive at once. And there was some great suggestions, quite multimedia suggestions, including like incorporating the history of this year in Zoom in the concert, and maybe having other choirs there via video link. Also inviting former members of the Pink Singers, so to really stress the diversity of age and experience in the choir. And we maybe need a really big venue if they're going to be involved in the concert, or us kind of going off stage and having, really the 40 years of the choir represented. And also things around like the subtle, Rebecca said, the subtle life of the choir and the everyday life of the choir, like a podcast with interviews with current and former members, or a documentary about being a chosen family came out. Yeah, that's my immediate memory. And thanks so much, Will, for being a scribe with all of our post-its in there.
We also talked about the idea of a podcast. I think so we were talking about sort of collecting oral histories. And when we did the 30th anniversary, there was a kind of a formality to it. We were taught about the process of it and about sort of being, but not imposing our own structures onto the story that people were telling. And so it involved a lot of effort. We had cameras, we had sound recording equipment. But I think a podcast is something that's much more accessible. It's very easy to capture someone's story because everyone's phone can record their voice. And it would be lovely to be able to sort of capture everyone's voice. And that's so easy to do. And it doesn't require like the whole structure around, this is an official archival process, and if it's accessible, I think that it makes it work really. And Pippa, in your group, what came up in your conversations?
So one thing was really looking back at the musical side of the choir and how the music and the politics have been so extremely like interwoven with each other, and potentially looking back at those really, really political roots. Similar, inviting former Pink Singers to join us or tell their stories. There were some really interesting things about looking at the moment where of like this sort of like data collection when you join the choir, maybe looking at whether people are happy to share their public profiles or their social media profiles as well, to sort of have that sort of organically branch out and see what people are up to, just as part of their work or as part of their volunteering time. Sort of on your point of oral histories, I think it's also important to remember that a lot of Indigenous and non-Western conceptualizations of oral history are also specifically about how history doesn't need to be captured in order to be valuable. Like the oral histories that we have in, the stories that we tell each other in the pubs, or that we just, that we share over like a picnic once we can again, are just as valuable and just as much part of our continuing archive as a podcast would be. So yeah, I just wanted to note that it doesn't we don't necessarily need to capture or pinpoint histories in order to value them and think of them as important.
No, absolutely. I totally agree with that. I in our group, we were talking about sort of how the ephemera, so all of the transit material that we generate, they have value in and of themselves, but they are also valuable because they help to trigger experiences and memories that we can then reconnect with. And there are lots of things that the choir is like an organism. It exists beyond the individual people who form it. So we're like the cells of an organism that will grow. New cells will join, old cells will go away. We all contribute to its life, and it has a life of its own. But the memory of it, its memory is actually contingent a little bit upon what we do at the moment then where we're part of that choir. So we had lots of discussions around how the ephemera is collected. In a way, it has to be that it should be automatic. We have a tendency to rely on the goodwill of people to take photographs, to give them to our archive. And maybe there should be ways of making it so that it becomes just part of the process, so that we don't necessarily have to think about it. The other example that I was thinking of was the Great Banana Mountain of 2013, which is the story that we all talk about. Jerome knows the story very well, but it's not archived anywhere. It's not written down anywhere. This is a story that we only tell each other, and I really value that story. But if we don't somehow put it somewhere, then we're going to forget, and that memory is going to go, and then the Pink Singers will not remember, in 20 years, will not remember that we ordered everyone to buy 5 bananas from a local spa to bring to the Troxy. And then we ended up having 5,000 million bananas in one place. So, it's just little things like that, which I just find it really fascinating. And there was lots of conversations around I think one of the things that came up was about how these things are stored, that even digital storage is not infinite. And so there sometimes needs to be decisions on what we keep and what we do not keep. And, you know, for instance, there may be things which may be artistically not optimal, and I'm not going to sort of give example, Gable's oboe, which we may not keep because it may not be it may not be the most fabulous performance we've ever done, but it was an experience, and that we will always remember that. And so how do we, at the time we might not think it's valuable, but it's only in hindsight that we think it does take on its own, it is important to us. So, you know, how do we make those kinds of decisions? So lots of things to really think about.
I just wanted to add Michael's idea about actually commissioning a work. So we've been talking quite a lot about art making along with archiving, and that's a really, you said it was quite an obvious idea, and I think that, yeah, obvious because it's a good one. And also, Mark, you were talking about a concert that's very politically oriented towards the next 40 years and the sort of much to be done idea. So I didn't want to forget to say those two things. And maybe bananas could be in the work of art that we commission, or the work of music.
In the archive from 2001, there's a brilliant film called A Season with the Pink Singers, 2001, where a documentary filmmaker literally followed the choir for an entire season, filmed rehearsals and trips abroad. And maybe something like that would be brilliant for the 40th, you know, to get some budget for it. It's a good film. I'd recommend watching it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, so lots and lots of things to think about. And, you know, this whole month has been really quite, I think, hopefully quite eye-opening and quite thought-provoking. I certainly found it very interesting, and just hearing the stories, but also understanding how we create spaces for different stories to be told, and how we collect the stories that are being told already, and make it part of our own stories. That brings us to the end of LGBT History Month 2021 from the Pink Singers. And I just want to thank everyone in the choir for participating today, and for my guests, Chris, our archives manager, and to Annie and Pippa, who are really fascinating and interesting things to say all the time about everything. Thank you very much, everyone.
I think before we finish, I would just, if you have any ideas you want to add to this conversation, you can email them to me. It's archive@pinksingers.co.uk, and we'll kind of continue the conversation, because I think this is just a starting point. It's important to make sure that communication is open to people who want to suggest things.
Yeah, so I wanted to add that the communities team has activities planned, at least one activity a month for the next few months or so. So please do stay tuned. The community team is slightly different sort of focus. It's really about our outward facing engagement with the LGBT community and other communities, maybe London or wide or further afield. So do stay tuned for things that are coming your way from us as well.
Brilliant. Well done, Hsien. Thank you for all that you've put in this month. It's been really, really excellent, very memorable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hsien. Thank you.